Hi, I'm Kirsty McQuaid. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the South African National Biodiversity Institute in Cape Town, and I'm also connected with the University of Plymouth in England. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at this event today, and to the previous speakers for setting the scene. I am going to speak to you a little bit now about work I've been involved in on spatial planning in large data poor areas. And I'll be speaking to a case study from an area in international waters of interest for seabed mining, and to a recent expansion of South Africa's offshore marine protected area network. So to start, I will briefly introduce seabed mining. I believe Lisa's already touched on this, so I won't go deeply into it, but there are a number of mineral deposits in international and national waters that are of interest for mining. These contain very high concentrations of commercially valuable metals that are used to manufacture a range of products. And there's been interest in mining these for some time, dating back to the 1960s and 70s. But in recent years, you may have seen in the news, this has come back into the spotlight again. The body mandated with administering contracts for seabed mining and ensuring the protection of the associated biodiversity in international waters is called the International Seabed Authority, or the ISA. And this body must make decisions on awarding contracts to explore for minerals, and is also charged with environmental management of seabed mining. So in recent years, the authority has been developing a set of regulations for the exploitation of seabed minerals in international waters. Currently, there's only exploration regulations exist, and this has been quite a contentious issue. Many scientists believe that we don't yet have sufficient information to ensure responsible management of seabed mining. From an environmental perspective, there's still quite large knowledge gaps on biodiversity in these areas, including really foundational biodiversity information like taxonomy, the spatial distribution of animals, life history traits, population connectivity, and the ecosystem services or functioning and services. And in the meantime, exploration for seabed minerals continues. And in the absence of this knowledge, the ISA must still develop environmental management plans for mining contract areas. So in this context, we undertook some work in an area called the Clarion-Clipperton Fracture Zone, which demonstrates an example of methods that can be used in large data poor areas to produce a practical tool to support decision making. And this map here shows the CCZ located between Hawaii and Mexico. It's an old map, but it will become clear in a moment why I'm showing this. So the gray blocks in the center of the map represent contracts with the ISA for exploration for deep sea minerals called polymetallic nodules. And the hashed squares on the periphery show areas of particular environmental interest, which are protected from mining. And so these include a core area at the center of 200 kilometers squared, surrounded by a buffer zone of 100 kilometers to protect against impacts which may cross over the boundary. So one of the key design principles of this APEI network when it was first established in 2011 was that it should be representative of the habitats of the region. So we wanted to produce a habitat map of this area to assess the representativity of the network, to see how it was performing in representing regional biodiversity. So naturally, to do this, you would need a huge amount of data. And so we used remote sensing data from satellites, which is much more readily available than, say, biological or geological samples, to produce a habitat map. And I'll show you how we did that now. So without going too deeply into it, animals show preferences for different environmental conditions. So for example, a coral might love to live on rugged terrain, in cold water at 1,000 meters deep. And so these methods allow you to predict where you might have different animal communities based on modeling of environmental niches. Habitat classifications categorize the marine environment into defined classes with different environmental properties. So if you look in the figure, you can see on the top row, you might have a habitat which is 200 to 700 meters, composed mainly of mud and sandy mud. And we assume that each of these different niches or habitats supports different biological communities. And maps that are produced using these habitat classifications can then feed into marine spatial planning processes and provide insight into the potential distributions of different habitats and species. So we did this in the CCZ. And the data we used were on topography, productivity, and nodule abundance, which have all been shown to, through scientific studies, to drive patterns of animal distributions in the region. And we worked at a scale of 1 kilometer squared. So this is an illustration of academic scientists and industry working nicely together, where we were able to obtain information on nodule abundance from industry partners. So we carried out a method called clustering on these data to produce a statistically derived habitat classification of the CCZ, showing different environmental niches across the region. And each is expected to support a different animal community. So each color in this map represents a habitat with a different set of topographic conditions, food availability, and substrate conditions. And you can see that there are a few really large habitats with many smaller ones spread across the region. And areas of high nodule abundance, which is the resource targeted here, are shown in brown. And you can see that these are mostly, mostly overlap with exploration contracts in the central CCZ, which are shown in black. So we then assess the representativity of the APEIs against targets set by the CBD, which is 10%, and then the IUCN World Park Congress, which is a 30% target. And these targets are shown with dotted lines in the graph there. We found that the APEI network fell short of representing all of the habitats in the region, and most of those lacking protection were habitats with high nodule abundance in the central CCZ, which is kind of to be expected. We identified habitats of concern as those with 10% or less of their area in the protected network, and those with high proportions of the total area located within potential mining areas, so within the exploration areas. But some of these habitats also had area in currently unmanaged areas, which are shown in dark blue. And so you could potentially implement further spatial management to protect these habitats. So we mapped habitats that were of concern, and we highlighted these as priority habitats that could be considered for further spatial management. And in this image, you'll see there are 2 additional APEIs in red that were being considered by the ISA at the time of publishing. And you can see that in one of the proposals, number 10 on the left, it overlaps with habitats of concern, which are shown here in pale brown. So ultimately, this habitat classification work fed into a larger process that was assessing the effectiveness of the APEI network with a lot of other data, a lot of other studies, that it was used in recommendations for additional APEIs in the CCZ. So on the right, we have additional APEIs shown in red that were declared by the ISA in 2021. And this case study demonstrates nicely how statistical methods on environmental variables in data-poor areas can be used to support iterative management or iterative improvement of spatial plans where decision-making is required despite having poor data availability. So this next section of my talk focuses on the establishment of South Africa's Offshore Marine Protected Area Network, which is a process that was led by Professor Kerry Sink from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. In 2019, 20 new offshore MPAs were declared in South Africa. This increased protection of our EEZ from 0.5% to 5.4%, and it advanced habitat representativity from 60% to 94%. It was a really long, 15-year-long process, which started in 2006. And it was really born to success through systematic conservation planning, robust stakeholder engagement, and eventually pushed over the line through ripe political opportunities. South Africa's oceans support a huge number of economic activities. We have over 20 fisheries sectors. We have oil and gas exploitation, seabed mining, exploration, aquaculture, shipping, tourism. And the process of establishing an offshore MPA network, as I said, started in 2006 with the inception of the Offshore Marine Protected Area project. And it was through this project that much of the data collation, the analysis and stakeholder consultation was undertaken. And this included analysis of eventually over 500 spatial layers, including human use and biodiversity information like species distribution or potential vulnerable marine ecosystems, important spawning grounds, all of that. And then also extensive iterative consultation with a wide range of sectors, including things like tourism, transport, defense, NGOs, but most particularly fisheries and oil and gas. So by 2011, the team involved had a proposal for areas for protection. But while much of this technical work was complete at that stage, the government then underwent a restructuring process and this stalled everything for several years. During this time, a multi-sector forum continued to meet and biodiversity layers were updated through national assessments. And then in 2014, this opportunity arose to push through to the final stages of implementation. And this opportunity, came as a government initiative actually called Operation Phikisa, which means hurry up in Sesotho, which is one of our 11 official languages in South Africa. And so Operation Phikisa was focused really on unlocking the economic potential of South Africa's oceans through something called Big Fast Results. And it includes setting really ambitious targets with detailed plans, emphasis on collaboration. It's very cross-sectoral, professional facilitators, and there's supposedly no hierarchy. And so in Phikisa, there were labs held for different focus areas, and one of these was marine protection services and governance. And so during this lab, senior scientists and government officials spent 6 weeks exploring the problems and the potential solutions, defining the challenges, developing these initiatives, and developing strategic plans. And through this, they came up with 2 principal areas of focus: integrated enforcement and marine protected areas. And this included the creation of a representative MPA network. And so through this process, it was noted that protection of ocean ecosystems is integral to sustainable ocean development. And these links were made to unlocking the ocean economy and conservation benefits like increasing ecosystem resilience, but also things like, creating certainty to streamline permitting processes and supporting eco certification. So this was the previous MPA network, which had an entirely coastal focus. You can see there's no protection of offshore habitats. And then this is the proposed MPA network in 2014. So this network took into account spatial distribution of different economic activities with the biodiversity layers, and carried out the systematic conservation planning to identify a proposed network of 22 MPAs. 18 of these were new, 3 were kind of extending existing MPAs. And the focus was really on maximizing biodiversity protection while minimizing impact on industries. So there were a whole suite of objectives of like including habitat representation, protecting sensitive ecosystems and things like that. And also prioritizing protecting the last remaining good condition of threatened ecosystems. So, as I said, the network was proposed after many, many iterations through extensive stakeholder consultation, where multiple scenarios were trialed and boundaries were negotiated, and it was then sent for legislatively required comment period. But a lot of those more meaty stakeholder consultations had already taken place at this stage. So finally, this is the map showing the network that was ultimately declared in 2019. 2 of the proposed MPAs were omitted from the network just because of multiple objections, and weaker supporting evidence, but 20 were declared. And 3% of that, 3 of the 5% are fully protected, and the remainder have multiple types of zones for, for example, different fishing practices. But legislation excludes prospecting and seismic surveys and petroleum extraction and mining from all of the MPAs. So if you'd like to learn more about the process, some of the challenges, some of the key lessons from this 15-year experience, the Professor Kerry Sink has just documented this whole process in a recent publication, and the website is linked there to learn more about the MPAs. So on that note, I'll finish. Thank you for your time today, and I am really looking forward to learning more about Israel's journey with marine spatial planning. Thanks.